area, and particularly in relation to the fact that the RMA is being reformed, and we need to ask questions about where that reform is going to take us, what impact it's going to have, and what should we be mindful about in considering the future of a planning environment that'll sustain a progressive society and not one which just liberalizes everything to the point where the environment is ruined. So Caroline, it's very good to have you here this evening. And thank you very much for agreeing to join to us. And I welcome you and listen to what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to the Fabians for extending an invitation to me. I'll just share my screen with me, not because I want to bore you with PowerPoints, it's just I've put a couple of things up that might just save me having to read out a whole lot of things and just make it clear for you to have it in front of you. Right, if I can just make a start. In putting this talk together, to some extent, I've been informed by a number of things. The first is that I was actually for many years a planning practitioner, and that means that I have practiced under the Town and Country Planning Act 1977 and under the Resource Management Act. And I certainly was in practice at the time that the Resource Management Act came into existence. And in terms of my time in the university sector, which started in 1995, my research interests have been in two places. The first, in terms of how the Resource Management Act actually was practiced, how it developed and how it worked out, because we were the first country to try and institute sustainability at a national level through planning legislation, but also through the research that has been part of my time in the university, and that is around the planning history of New Zealand. And my PhD thesis actually looked at how town planning was established in New Zealand from around 1900 right through into the 1930s. And I've subsequently done quite a lot of research beyond that period. So if you want, this is a planning historian's and a planning practitioner's view of where we might be going in terms of the present day reforms. Because we are again a crossroads, and the recent exposure draft, the Natural and Built Environments Planning Bill, which in actual fact in many ways was unusual in two different ways. First, that it was being revealed at such an early stage, but second, that it had been put together in such an extensive form long before there had been any real public consultation on what would replace the Resource Management Act. That is quite unusual and is certainly quite different to what happened when the Resource Management Act came into existence and in the process that was used to formulate it. But it is yet another U-turn in our planning system. And it means that we will plunge into a lot of the uncertainties that are always associated with sweeping away the past and replacing it with a new vision. And that's certainly what this bill does on how we plan for the present and, most importantly, in the future. I think it's time for us to take stock of our planning system and to really consider who it now empowers, who it tends to ignore, and how it might be refocused to deliver a more equitable system that is more interested perhaps in the community as a whole rather than the needs of a particular part of the development community. Now, despite the common myths that exist among planners and others, we have actually had planning legislation in New Zealand since 1926. And that legislation, despite a depression and the Second World War, had by the late 1940s actually produced a number of town plans. And I've certainly seen a whole array for a variety of different sizes of cities. But Auckland had basically a plan approved under the 26 Act. The whole intention of the 26 Act was to try and ensure that our towns and cities, and it was very urban-based legislation, developed in a manner that in very simplest terms ensured that it was a controlled expansion of the urban area, but most importantly, that it secured a pleasant living environment for those who dwell in those towns and cities. And you can see that in the general purpose of planning, which was to develop the town or city in such a way as must effectively promote its healthfulness, amenity, convenience, and advancement. So very progressivist, but also very concerned with the everyday aspects of life. It was replaced in 1953 by the Town and Country Planning Act, and that retained a very similar focus. You can see the purpose of a district scheme, and this was repeated elsewhere in the Act at the regional level, but those plans were never very developed under the 53 Act. It will most effectively tend to promote and safeguard health, safety, and convenience, and the economic and general welfare of its inhabitants and the amenities of every part of the area. So in other words, it was broadening the ambit for planning, but also very, very much focused on what might be of interest, if you want, to the community as a whole, and focused on things that affected their everyday life. So you can see there's actually a theme developing here, and you can see that term amenity coming up again and again, but also the perpetual interest in health, well-being alongside community. So in combination, these different concerns, the planning was focused on trying to create and sustain good living environments. In very simple terms, they were to be pleasant to live in and that they would reflect community, national values and concerns. It's also very much a planning system that is really focused on land, how it's used, and what activities occur on it. By the 1980s, we'd even started to recognise some Māori concerns as well. So essentially, our planning legislation developed in a very linear and evolutionary manner from 1926 to 1977, when the Town and Country Planning Act was repealed and replaced. Essentially, the difference between the 53 and the 77 Act is that the 77 Act gives a lot more, if you want, flexibility to communities and to planners and to councils in terms of how they shaped plans for their area. And you can see that also in the way the 77 Act brings forward matters of national importance. So in other words, here are some things that are important to the whole of New Zealand and things that every plan should provide for. Lots of them, if you actually look at them carefully, are actually still in the Resource Management Act, but equally very focused on saving farmland as well, preventing sporadic subdivision, urban development in rural areas, and protecting productive land. But you can see that in the last one, Māori issues are actually coming to the fore as well. What was the Resource Management Act then, and why did the 77 Act need replacing? Well, essentially it came from the desire of Geoffrey Palmer, but also a lot of agitation from the development community that planning in terms of the Town and Country Planning Act and many other pieces of legislation that controlled other resources made for a somewhat clumsy, time-consuming and expensive system. So we get the Resource Management Act as the result. The RMA was very much a revolutionary change, and it was the first act in the world, and certainly in New Zealand, to try and insert those emerging concerns with environmental sustainability into an act, which also simultaneously promised developers a faster, simpler and cheaper planning system. How anybody could come to that conclusion from a quick glance at the RMA, I never really understood. And they use that became two irreconcilable aims: to protect the environment and actually facilitate development and through a system that was faster, simpler and cheaper. And it was that inconsistency within the heart of the RMA that ensured that it failed to ever convince either the environmentalists or the developers that this was actually their answer to their concerns. So to some extent, what you're seeing is disillusionment with whatever planning legislation existed. But perhaps I think what we're seeing with the RMA is a depth of disillusionment, which is greater than we saw with the previous legislation. Perhaps because the RMA has been left around too long. It is quite old legislation and it's lasted a lot longer than any other planning legislation we've had. Key in the Act was the attempt to focus on this new concept of sustainable management. And Section 5 contains the whole definition of sustainable management. But I've put part of it up here because it does still actually mimic that cultural well-being, health, safety, enabling communities that was in that earlier legislation. So we got sustainable management, but we got it in a period of the neoliberalist Rogernomics period. And that meant that sustainable management is a very New Zealand concept. You won't find it anywhere else. In essence, it's sustainable development with the social and economic elements removed to focus solely on the environment. There was a belief that that would work. And I think some of the failings of the Resource Management Act would suggest that that hasn't been the case. And I certainly think it's an object lesson for the future. So while the purpose of the RMA might be contested and protecting property rights a little bit too prominent in its approaches, planning still remained very grounded at the local level. And planning had always, from its very inception in New Zealand, been a local government responsibility, and that continued with the Resource Management Act. But our planning system has always been a very open system. We have what's known as third-party appeal rights, which are very unusual, and we've certainly always allowed submitters the right to participate in the process of producing plans and guaranteed them appeal rights these days effectively as far as the Supreme Court. And New Zealanders have proved to be enthusiastic participants in the consultatory approaches used to create plans, and using those very rights to seek changes to proposed plans or to contest resource consent applications. Originally, the RMA, and certainly when I was a practitioner, allowed for quite extensive opportunities to comment on and to challenge specific developments that are proposed through the resource consent system. That is often seen in the press and elsewhere as producing NIMBYism. And I think you have to be very careful how you use that term. People do have the right to try and protect what they have and what they enjoy. That's what Amenity is about. And there's always a presumption that these NIMBYist responses have always stopped very worthy developments, and they're there only to protect those who live in these apocryphal leafy suburbs. But in reality, there is no good researched evidence to support these claims that all submissions are in essence negative. In most cases, the critics and the politicians are very happy to rely on apocryphal stories. They make great press. But from my experience in practice and from talking more recently to practitioners, most submissions still come from communities that surround the actual development site. And that is the very community which will continue to host and experience any effects of the new activity long after the developer has left the scene. And that surely makes it essential that those affected communities are given a say in what happens in their neighbourhood. And that's really what we relate to And that is perhaps why that concept of amenity and well-being, etc., has been part of our planning legislation right through to the RMA. And that also led communities to take up that term amenity and to use it as a sort of shorthand way of describing what they were trying to protect or to avoid having affected by some new development. It's about the qualities and the values that made the area they live in the place that they enjoyed living in. However, through a whole series of amendments, and the RMA must be the most amended piece of legislation after the Local Government Act, the government has ensured that those rights to be heard have been reduced and constrained. So instead of working out how better to balance the rights of developers and residents, the aim seems to have become to limit the question of development proposals. I won't describe the technical details, but take it from me. We never publicly notify very high proportions of consents. Something between 95 and 98% of all resource consents in New Zealand are not notified, so they're never offered to the community for comment. However, reading in the press, you'd assume that the figure was the other way around, and that 98% of them were notified. And of the ones that are notified, a very high proportion are actually granted, and a very small proportion ever even go to appeal. So it's a very responsive system. That isn't how you would assume it was from what you see in the press. However, those amendments are only part of the many amendments that have been undertaken to the RMA, and certainly it now looks like a patchwork quilt produced by a whole group of beginners overseen by a dysfunction committee. So what are we going to replace it with? Well, we are going to replace it with 3 pieces of legislation. One will certainly deal with really focus solely on climate change and its effects, and we certainly haven't seen that draft yet. The second one will be looking at spatial planning, mainly focused on infrastructure. Again, we haven't seen that. And then the third one is, in essence, really the core planning legislation, this Natural and Built Environment Act. And that is what we've seen the exposure draft of. To my horror, in some ways, it is once again revolutionary change. Now, the problem with revolutionary change is, in essence, you chuck away the past, you say it's no good, you demonize it, and you tend to lose some of the good things that any act and any system has. And you replace it with the unknown, which has to be worked out, which has to be put in place, and that will take a number of years. I don't care, don't believe anybody who tells you any different. Certainly that was the experience of the Resource Management Act. Now, yes, technology has sped up the exchange of information, etc. Nevertheless, it will take quite a long time. But that's what we're embarking on yet again. And I think that that, in some ways, is a mistake. Certainly, we are ditching sustainable management. Not surprisingly, it's not necessarily worked. And the whole focus of the new legislation will be on te oranga o te tau. And you can see that it does still touch on a lot of sustainability concepts, and certainly has a very environmental focus, but a filter of te ao Māori, and that will be much stronger in terms of how the legislation develops and what its focus is. And it will remain, of course, to see how this actually operates in practice. There is also references, as in the RMA, to protecting the environment, to avoiding, remedying or mitigating adverse effects on the environment, and supporting the well-being of present generations without compromising future generations. So still very much a sustainability concept. And hopefully, because it does have some of those concepts in, some of the new provisions will be able to draw on the past. But I think the devil is always in the detail. And we will also have quite a long period where we're waiting for the courts to establish what some of these new concepts actually mean. And that, by the way, will take longer. I remember there were some contentious parts of the RMA. We were told that we would get decisions from the Planning Tribunal, then renamed the Environment Court, which would indicate exactly what that particular provision meant. It took years to get them, because in essence, you are dependent on a case going to the to appeal that asks the right question to get the answer that you need. However, perhaps a piece that I and others have found quite disturbing is that the term amenity seems to have been completely expunged from our planning legislation, despite the fact it's been there since 1926. Presumably, this is a way of reducing submissions in opposition to plans and developments that are often based on amenity concerns. Yes, those amenity concerns may have been overstated, they may have been misused, but why do we think removing them completely is necessarily the answer when we're taking away from the community one of the prime ways of expressing a quite complex relationship that they have with the place that they live? And surely if COVID's taught us anything, it is where you live is very important. It's worrying also that such a key term and concepts are going to be abandoned because their views are standing in the way of yet again those worthy developments. And that really highlights one of the concerns I've got with the way planning in New Zealand seems to have developed in the last 20 years or so, and how it looks as if it's going to develop in the future. In terms of any new development, there are basically three players. There's a developer. That's the person who proposes and finances development. They're the group or the company that's taking the risk, and they have a lot to lose, and there's no way I'd want to be a developer, thank you. It's very high risk activity. Then there are those who live adjacent to any proposed development, and they are the ones who will, in the longer run, have to live with whatever change that development brings. Then there's the city or district council, the consenting body. And so each of those groups has a quite different focus. Yes, developers are needed. Yes, I don't expect them not to want to realise a profit. They often take very high risks. That's fine. What I'm saying is that surely what we need is a greater balance. And I don't see that in this new bill. What I see is things being tipped more and more towards the benefit of facilitating development processes. Now, sometimes that's being ascribed to the requirements to meet the needs of dealing with housing crisis. I'd observe this is our most recent housing crisis. There have been housing crises in New Zealand's history for as long as there has been New Zealand. But what you are actually benefiting is a developer who really has the shortest involvement in what is being created, and who is able to and does walk away when there are unexpected adverse impacts. And it is the community and the council often that are left to deal with the fallout when there are unexpected adverse effects. And take it from me, environmental impact assessments are not. They do come into existence, and frequently they're quite significant. So increasingly our planning system, instead of providing for extensive opportunities to comment and challenge, is in actual fact reducing those opportunities in the interest of development, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Community involvement is constantly seen as negative, and yet I've seen many cases over many years where that community involvement can and does help to shape much better long-term outcomes. the submission rights that have been eroded in the RMA seem to be further eroded. And we're going to move to a much more centralised decision-making through the regional bodies that are likely to be much removed from communities. That is going to increase the erosion of local democracy that has in the past been at the heart of our planning decision-making. Because the idea is, always in the New Zealand system, you should make decisions as close to the affected area as possible. So what we have gradually seen is elected councillors are not making decisions on planning issues. That's tending to be handed to independent decision makers, independent hearing commissioners, and that is going to be further promoted in the new bill. In essence, councillors no longer will be the decision makers. We're also moving from local decision making, city district level, to some regionally based decision making. But also, perhaps one of the more concerning aspects of the new legislation is the reassertion of central government's role in our planning system. Certainly, central government has been part of our planning system in the past, but this new act is going to accelerate that. We are going to have a national, sorry, I've just lost me. We're having a national planning framework, which with a whole series of environmental outcomes will in actual fact set the direction for planning across the country. And I can see some problems with that because New Zealand has a very uneven, for instance, urban hierarchy. We have Auckland at the top, very, very much bigger, and we do not have the normal sort of cities of descending size coming down from that. And so we are trying to build a planning system that is going to successfully create plans for all those different sizes and different types of towns and cities across the country. That, as they would say, seems to be a bit of a big ask. Also, the environmental outcomes are really comprehensive in their coverage, and they are bringing into our planning system some new concerns. And most interestingly, at last, New Zealand has joined the rest of the world and actually joined together housing and planning. It's something that's common overseas. There were attempts to do it historically in New Zealand that failed. And so housing has always been something over here and the planning system is over there. But one of the environmental outcomes is going to require housing supply to provide choice to consumers. Well, housing choice is a pretty complex issue, and it's usually a product of financial wherewithal rather than anything that planning can influence. Housing choice covers a variety of situations. Are we talking about choice of where the house is located, the type of housing that's made available, or choice in the style or the look of the housing? Plans can offer opportunities to developers to build a whole variety of housing types. That doesn't mean that they will do it. They will tend to build what they think will sell. That's logical. Plans and planners are going to be very hard pressed to compel any choice of housing to be made available. So how is that outcome going to be achieved? And also, if you look at analyses of the New Zealand housing market, one of the things that's often highlighted is that the cost of our housing is increased by our mania for having the house of our choice in terms of style. And houses that can be built more quickly and more cheaply, the type of estate or tract style housing you get common overseas just simply is not acceptable to the same degree in New Zealand. So other aspects of the outcomes, these environmental outcomes, also perpetuate the idea, quite simplistically, that if we just increase the supply of land and the supply of houses, then everything will be fine and housing affordability will be solved. Oh, that it was so simple. So what are we going to plan for and who are we going to plan for in the future? It's been clear for some time, and you can see it in the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. They instituted a requirement for Tier 1 cities. That's basically Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Hamilton and Tauranga, to produce more medium density and high density housing, remove requirements for car parking, etc. The proposed reforms in terms of the RMA's replacement, and the legislation that is being put through at present that is going to allow, as of right, 3-story developments anywhere in our larger cities, those Tier 1 cities that I just noted. They're all signs that central government is taking up the reins in planning and is going to tell communities what is good for them. So we're going to see a planning system that will increasingly be directed and shaped by national defined priorities, and that will be less reflective of local ideas of what makes a livable environment and how communities want their neighbourhoods to look like and to be the places they want to live in. The desire to promote more development, particularly of housing, and the belief that the development community can and will always produce quality living environments is going to be very deeply embedded in our planning system. And I certainly think if you've listened to any of the submissions on the proposed legislation that's going through at the moment with regard to 3-story development, you can see I'm not the only person who's concerned that developers will not necessarily produce quality outcomes that the government clearly thinks they're going to. Equally, environmental concerns, which are a significant aspect of dealing with climate change, don't look to be any better served by the RMA's replacement, partly because New Zealand seems to have this problem with committing to doing anything significant or substantial in the environmental area, particularly in terms of affecting any of the things that are perhaps contributing to climate change. We've been very slow, for instance, to abandon coal or to look at any alternatives in terms of transport. And so really what we seem to be about to do is to re-embed those two irreconcilable aims of achieving environmental protection and facilitating development that has dogged the RMA into this new legislation. So we're going to have a more centralised planning system, given that the whole governance structure is going to be based at the regional level, which carries with it the danger that the voice and the preferences of towns and cities will actually be muted, as they are only going to be granted a very limited voice on these new regional councils. It'll also take plans and plan making further away from local communities, imposing strategies and approaches determined by local government. And frankly, local government has in recent years had very, very little experience in the whole planning arena at all. At the moment, they are frantically recruiting planning staff. I hate to tell you, there's a national shortage of planners in this country, and they're having a hard time of it. I think what that's going to lead to is a real sameness in how we plan, which is going to, and there's been lots of agitation for this, but really it will benefit a relatively small number of companies who actually do developments across the whole New Zealand. There are not as many of them as you might think, and tipping the whole planning system further in favour of development. Perhaps most importantly for me, as a planner and a professional planner of many years standing, I fear that planning and planners will remain the scapegoats, the convenient scapegoats whenever anything is wrong. We are apparently the cause of the housing crisis, and we are Machiavellian in our efforts to ensure communities don't get what they need. It seems to overlook the fact that planners do actually live in these very communities. But we'll also become the convenient scapegoats when our attempts yet again to revolutionise our planning system once again becomes a challenge that we find difficult to fully and successfully address. research.
Thank you, Caroline. That was certainly a good deal of material, and I really appreciate the depth and care you put into thinking about your presentation. Can I open the conversation up for questions and discussion? If you want to ask a question, please go down to that little thing on the bottom line there where you can stick a hand up, and that indicates sort of people have got discussions, and we can do it in an orderly sort of a fashion. I'm looking for people who may be looking to put their hand up, but there isn't one there at the moment. Caroline, can I ask you if you are worried about the type of person who goes into being a planner nowadays? Do we know who the type of person is that wants to be a planner, that leaves school or develops a professional interest in being a planner and therefore goes on to want to be an advocate for the type of society they want to live in?
I think in actual fact, planning education is focused in two areas in this country: undergraduate students who come basically straight from school, though increasing, in fact, we are seeing more mature students also taking up the opportunity of second chance education often. They're often some of our better students, to be honest, just because they have that greater experience of life. No, they tend to come in as reasonably enthusiastic, often very environmentally focused, but for a lot of them, they do discover that planning is very much about people, and that develops across their planning education. Planning at the undergraduate level is a 4-year degree for that reason, and I think that that's actually quite useful because it allows them some time to mature and also widens the breadth of their education because they do have 4 years to achieve it. But also we have a master's level qualification, which is offered at a number of New Zealand universities, including Massey. And what we tend to see, certainly from my experience over many years, is a lot of those master's students are people who have come to planning because they want to create a better world and a better community, because they're often people who are mature students who have been in practice perhaps in a different area or are doing a career change or whatever, and so they certainly do come. So I think actually most planners, and the New Zealand Planning Institute certainly does try to advocate a lot for, if you want, more community-based approaches. But yes, there is plenty of good people in planning. Unfortunately, it is a very stressful profession, and both in New Zealand and overseas, many times it's been considered what they call a toxic profession, and it does mean you often do lose practitioners.
Thank you, Caroline. Jennifer, I see you've got a question. Jennifer Hand, do you want to turn your... Coming. Come on, Jennifer.
Hello, this is not Jennifer, this is actually Julie. Sorry about that. Caroline, thank you very much for your discussion. It was, I think, extremely informative. I just want to propose what is probably a slightly controversial proposition based on research that I was part of in a northern community, rural community area. And that was the conclusion that some of us came to, that having decisions at the highly local area was simply too costly in social terms for people who had different views on sustainability and conservation to be able to express them and still maintain their social relationships in the community. I'd like to hear your comments about that, please.
Yes, that can be a problem. When I was a practitioner, actually did quite a lot of rural planning work. And I do understand that you have to continue to live in the community where you're perhaps now being almost in a stand-up argument with your nearest neighbour. And that is a problem. However, at least if these things happen at a local level, there is a certain goodwill and understanding and shared experience that might eventually bring a compromise that both sides can live with. And a lot of planning is about finding those compromises. If you have a more centralized system, in essence, my concern is that your voice will be lost completely, and that the cost and effort of participating will become significant, and that local concerns will be much easier to overlook or to ignore. So I suppose it is a balancing act. Sometimes also with time, people do reconcile themselves to a compromised position. But yes, at times you can get issues that divide communities, and that isn't just planning issues. I think you're seeing it with COVID at the moment, that there are issues that are dividing communities, because there always are. It's just trying to find the compromises. But I think we've probably got more chance now than we're going to have in the future. If things become more centralised, there's every chance you're not going to be asked. You will have. My concern is that we're going to see a lot of things brought down from on high. And if the 3 stories, 3 buildings and up to 3 stories anywhere is an indication of the quality of planning that's going to come from central government, then I think you better hang on to your hats, because it's going to be a rough ride.
Thank you. Thanks.
Alex, you're there. Have you got a question? Alex, can you turn your mic on to talk? Alex.
I'm so sorry. The Mr. Whippy van came past my house and my children descended on me.
Sorry.
So my question is there anything that local government can do to try and work with the proposals coming from central government to try and get the best outcomes that we can?
I think it depends on I think local government at the moment is going to be faced with being assailed on many fronts. I mean, 3 waters is a huge issue, and that on top of RMA reform is going to be challenging, partly because it's not clear to me whether central government, what was in the exposure draft, is going to remain largely unchanged, or if the government will in actual fact take any notice of any of the submissions that were made. Because remember, this is an informal process in many ways. So they are perfectly within their rights to say, interesting, thank you, goodbye. You might remember the huge public consultation exercise after the Christchurch earthquake, when the people of Christchurch were asked how did they want to see their new city develop. And that was very much a case of huge public response. And thank you very much. Central government's taken over now. We now have our new Christchurch Planning Authority. And here's your plan, here's what's going to happen. And I don't really think there was much cognizance taken of any of those ideas, despite the fact some of them were not achievable. So I think local government, it will be good if it can keep its eye on the many balls that are revolving in the air and influence central government to perhaps look again at the legislation. I think this retreat to the regional level is interesting, because at the moment the presumption is that those regional councils are going to be the 12 regional councils and unitary authorities we presently have. I don't think there's actually anything there that says that's the case. And given the 3 waters is based on just the division of the country into 4, that may be a model rather than 12. So all of that's quite important. I think we stand to lose a lot if local government loses planning from what its responsibilities are. I don't think it's incompetent at doing that. And I'm not sure that central government has demonstrated huge competence so far. So yeah, I think really local government in New Zealand has got a huge task in front of it. But I think perhaps we've all learnt from the Resource Management Act. Certainly I think the planning profession has. I think last time we were all genteel and modest and decided to work behind the scenes to try and achieve change in the RMA, which it was completely unsuccessful. I say that as someone who's read the files because I wrote the history of the SMPI, and definitely was not a winning strategy. This time we seem to be going in boots and all, and seem to be having more success at having our voice heard. And given that we'll be the ones who'll be stuck implementing whatever comes out the other end, then I think that's quite important. Poor Richard Laheron wants a word.
Richard.
Sorry, I've known Richard for a long time.
Yeah, kia ora, Caroline. Thank you very much for such an interesting and helpful outline of planning history and a summation of the kinds of key issues that are currently facing planners in the community and iwi and so on and so on. In addition to the kind of focus on local government needs to resist, I'm also interested in taking the discussion back to how might planners be educated. And I was really struck by your number of, there are about roughly 20 major developers who do most of the development work in New Zealand. I'm interested in the extent to which planning curriculum gets into building would-be planners' capacities to deal on the one hand with local government, on the other hand with central government, and on the other hand with developers who are mutating in all sorts of ways. So as an educator, I am interested in your views on this.
We do try to prepare our students for the complex tapestry that is the world they're going to work in. And I think perhaps that's what's changed over the time that I've been in planning education, is that when I started at Massey in 1995 as a lecturer, predominantly our students went out to work in local government. There would be a tiny number, like 4 or 5, would go to central government. But generally we were producing planners for local government, and there was a few consulting firms, but they were not huge. Now I'd say it's sort of a 3-way split, that some quite a number still go to local government, but increasingly numbers go to central government and to things like NZT, Waka Kotahi, and those sorts of agencies of government. And certainly the consultancies take a lot more planners than they used to. And some of them, in actual fact, have excellent systems for graduate training. Because as you know, Richard, you can teach students lots of things, you can't teach them experience. However, what we do try to do is use a lot of what we call experiential learning. And that's in essence setting up systems whereby you make the students in essence become a consulting planner for an organisation, or dealing with a developer, or dealing with a council, or dealing with a central government policy, or whatever. I had my 4th years creating housing policy. They were taking a central government initiative and working out what you would do at the local government level. So they are put into situations where they are acting in. Perhaps the hardest thing to try and teach them is how to deal with developers. Partly because the development community in New Zealand is quite diverse. You certainly get the big players, and they are no trouble. frankly, because they tend to employ a lot of staff, architects, engineers, planners, their own planners. So they tend to understand how the system works. They understand how to play the game, and so it can be sort of high-level negotiations, but nevertheless, they're not the most difficult ones to deal with are the small-term developers who refuse to get any professional help in any direction. We still think you can drop a plan on the back of an envelope and that's fine. We can all remember them, and I have to say, hand on heart, the dodgy developer that I dealt with for many years at City Council is still operating 20 years later. So they are the harder ones to actually prepare students for, partly because they will never believe what some people might do. They tend to learn quite quickly. But I think you have to accept that planning is a profession, and all professions depend on the getting a broadly based education in a university and a specific education in terms of their profession. But then in the space of their first year, 2 years in practice, building up a whole accompanying level of knowledge and skills that can actually only be gained in the workplace. I think perhaps what we are benefiting from at the moment, and certainly I see it in our students, is the fact that more local authorities, more consultants, even some developers are taking on students for summer work again in a way that we lost for a period when the economy wasn't as good. And that is hugely beneficial if they can actually be in the workplace on a part-time basis or over summer break, because it's certainly, they do understand very much better the complexity of the world they're going out to work in. And in actual fact, it's probably a minority of students now that don't get that experience before they go into practice. So I think that's hugely beneficial. And I think we're probably seeing more people doing master's level degrees, and they tend to be older, they tend to be more mature, and they tend to be more experienced. Often they are actually working in a planning context. So I think that does help. But yes, but still equally, you can't teach experience. And that is why they find their first year in practice usually quite tiring and fairly stressful.
You want to follow up, Richard?
Oh, no, I really had no idea what direction Caroline would go in, but it is certainly interesting to hear about some of the transitions that have taken place in terms of the complement of planners and where they've gone, and the sort of re-emergence of studentships, so to speak, in different workplaces. That's really helpful. I guess if there was a follow-up, it would be what would be the 5 things that you think planning education should emphasize to these students as they go into the world where they will discover things?
Well, I think the first thing is that you never stop learning. And I think, the New Zealand Planning Institute requires us to do 25 hours of continuing professional development every year to maintain our full membership. And I think that's a signal that you are never going to stop learning. The second is that you will make mistakes, but you will learn from them because nobody's perfect. Thirdly is that you must never lose sight of who you are planning with. In other words, you need to understand your community. I always try to point out to students that, reading your community newspaper or your local newspaper is really very, very important, because that's how you find out what's happening. And that you need to never lose sight of that, because in the end, that's what planning is about. It's there build better communities in many ways, or to at least maintain what's there. Secondly, also, fourthly, is that planning is very much a political activity, and that you cannot separate it from politics. Local body politics, central government politics, international politics. They're always going to have an influence, and you should always be aware of it. And finally, you have to see planning within the greater context of what's happening in the country as a whole, because that is always going to offer opportunities, but also create limitations. And so it's really important that you understand what underpins the New Zealand economy, for instance. I suppose that's one of the things that I've been a little bit disappointed with since NCEA has been in place, is that students do come to us at undergraduate level with a quite limited worldview and a quite limited understanding of how New Zealand works, let alone the world. So in fact, I teach. No longer teaching.
No, thank you. That was an interesting.
I am teaching.
Very good to
I
hear.
used to teach first year paper in semester one. So this is bright and shiny, first thing in, hardly no up from down. And we do the basics of New Zealand, population, economics, activity, all sorts of things, because I can no longer rely on them having any of that knowledge. And some of them are quite stunned to find out all sorts of things about New Zealand they never knew. But they really do need to know to be a good planner. So, they would be the things that I would want students to always have in mind. And certainly do not ever think you're going to stop learning, because you won't. You just have to keep.
Thank you, Caroline. Now, Raymond, I think you've had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, for a really interesting and quite challenging presentation. I would just say, would you agree that we do have a crisis of affordable housing in this country? And I also think that a lot of this local input and local democracy and say into local planning is the privilege of the affluent. I live in a very affluent area of Auckland, and I must say that the infill and all the rest of it is pretty good design, and there's been some successful campaigns to protect heritage buildings. And I think that, for a lot of New Zealanders who are desperate to get into their first home or to have decent rental housing, they shouldn't have to, but there might be a compromise on amenity, which I think could be addressed by good design manuals, as in the Auckland Unitary Plan, and also that local government can do a lot. So if people are living in less than optimum dwellings in terms of the town planning, the provision of parks and open spaces, the design of the streets for walkability and all the rest of it. So yeah, I suppose, and I think as with Three Waters, local government sometimes does not have a great track record in actually addressing those major issues. So I just put it there that, I absolutely take on board all that you say, the dangers of the legislation that we put there, but I think there is another side to that as well.
I'm quite aware there's another side to it. And if housing affordability could simply be achieved through just allowing more dense development and not worrying about amenity, etc., then maybe that would be fine. Unfortunately, you will find the poorest quality developments will be done in the poorest communities, because that's what always happens. And so surely it's even more important that those people do have some amenities around them. The problem is, particularly if you look at this present legislation, is it presumes that just plonking buildings onto sites is an answer, and that it doesn't really matter what lives people are going to live in them. I think, central government, who gave us the fabulous star flats, lovely 3-story buildings, terrible. I don't think that that's actually a sign that they're necessarily great they're going to achieve great design outcomes in that way. The problem is, if in a built-up area you don't build in some amenity at the outset, you're never going to be able to retrofit it in. If you look at things like parks and open space, you're not going to create that after an area has been developed, because simply land values rise far too quickly. So we've got lots to lose, and remember, all of these buildings are going to be there for a very long time. So if you make a mistake now, you're going to be living with it for 50, 60, 100 years. Added to which, housing affordability, you do have to look at the other side of the equation. Some of the issues with housing affordability stem from the fact New Zealand is a low-wage economy. And it has been for quite a long time. So we need to look at the other side of the coin. Also, we need to do some decent research, because most of what we have proposed at the moment is not. Yes, the Auckland plan, in actual fact, had done a very good job of promoting high density developments in the right places along transport routes, etc. Only now for them to be ridden roughshod over with some sort of universal, let's slap it on to. The problem is that if you talk to any planner who's had any experience, they will tend to accept developers will tend to develop to the lowest common denominator, because if they can achieve an outcome that way that they can sell, they then walk away, and that's fine, because that is their role. But that is surely why we need rules, and we need some other things in there so that communities do have a decent living environment. I mean, that's my concern. I mean, the most likely outcome of what's being proposed at the moment, and what is going to be passed, because it will, government has a majority, is a return to the lovely 1960s sausage flats. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a great thing. Added to which, yeah, we could go on all night, but I think it's, yeah, you may have outcomes you don't like, and then you're going to live with them for a very long time, and the people who will suffer will be people on the lowest income in the most difficult situation, because they will end up with the poorest housing choices.
Alex, I'm happy to have you back again for another question.
Thank you. Yes, you said something very interesting about the economy of New Zealand and understanding what that is. And when I was looking at some of the cabinet documents around the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, it seemed to be rooted in the urban growth agenda, which itself seemed to be rooted in economic development, almost creating housing as an economy rather than creating housing for families to live in. And I'm wondering what the trade-off here is between economic activity and children's well-being, and what the outcomes will be, particularly for children.
Well, the problem is I don't think children have a particularly strong voice in any system. They really do depend on us to provide a living environment that works for them. I think this is one of the issues with high density developments, that for high density developments to work, and they can work, there's no reason they can't, you need to look at it in terms of what you're doing in a neighborhood as a whole. And that involves saying, what can we do with the existing open space? What do we have to provide for in there? And what can we do in a more compact manner? And in essence, what happens in the greater neighbourhood compensates for the fact that you don't have the same on-site amenity that you might have in a lower density situation. So I think that's perhaps what good planning would do. And Natalie Allen, who did work for a PhD on Auckland in that sort of whole amenity area, she actually looked at what people sort of saw as a decent trade-off between, this isn't really my preferred living situation, a medium density development, but here's some things, if they were in my neighbourhood, would make me feel better about it, would sort of provide some amenity values and sort of compensation for that trade-off. And it was quite interesting what people wanted, and certainly things like playgrounds were quite prominent because people were accepting that more children, for instance, would be brought up in those situations. And I think there's been a lot of work done around what you can do. There's lots of stuff you can do with little pocket parks, etc. So I think, but you can't do that sort of planning if you just say, we'll leave all the responsibility for development with developers, because they're never going to do those things, because they're interested in only in the particular site that they own and nothing else. And that instead, a lot of that neighbourhood, that greater planning, will get left to local authorities, but local authorities who are sort of working with this ever developing complicated canvas as individual developers do their thing. And that is where some of your controls can sometimes be useful, to try and bring in some of those neighbourhood concerns. So it's very much a trade-off, but I think you can do things. And as I say, I do think the unitary plan was gradually getting in that direction, and had done so over a whole lot of consultation and discussion and compromises, etc. And I think it's very sad to see central government riding over the top of it based on not a lot of research, not any planning research anyway. I believe there was some economic research was done that was used as a justification.
Ali, can I draw you in? You've got a question. Thanks, Alex.
Oh yes, I really enjoyed the presentation. I work as a postie in central Wellington, and I mean, I think the Wellington City Council was just about to bring out their housing policy when the government brought out theirs. So I mean, I do think the central government had the run on the city council, and there was just so much development, so many apartments going up, skyscraper apartments in Victoria Street, and you know, there are many cranes working in Tory Street and just apartments galore. And I don't see, apart from what do you call it, the Anzac Memorial, a big green space up the top, I don't really see many playgrounds happening up in that space between that and Courtney Place. So I mean, yeah, you're right, we have Pigeon Park, but there's, you know, for the untold, untrammeled developments, I mean, God knows what Arrow Street's going to look like if there's going to be 3-story buildings. I mean, sight lines are being changed dramatically left, right and centre from the top of Arrow Street to across the town. The skylines being, yeah, certainly compromised.
However, what might save parts of Wellington is the fact that a lot of sites in Wellington are quite small and they're not exactly flat, and that makes them much harder to develop and much more expensive to develop. So it may be what saved bits of the city. But as you say, there's already a lot of development going on, which is yeah, that's why there is a feeling that if these 3-story developments do take off, they will tend to take off on the periphery of cities, not in the developed city, because it's on the periphery where they'll get the easier and bigger sites to develop, and probably cheaper than trying to take an inner city site and actually clear it before they actually develop it. And that is the substantial costs in that clearing process.
I think one of the euphemisms for such planning in Auckland now is the word tree. If ever you can start something of an opposition or a resistance, you highlight the nature of a tree, or the significance of the wooded suburb or the wooded lanes, and you've already got yourself on a moral high ground. It's a euphemism for a whole lot of things to do with the quality of living we want to have in the city, particularly that inner city area.
Yes. Oh, there is much talk of the leafy suburbs, but in actual fact, what they're reflecting are the period in which they were subdivided and developed, and the fact that they've been there for a longer time, so you've got lots of mature trees and the like. But most suburban areas do tend to gradually take on a more treed appearance. However, if we are gradually getting to much smaller sites, and I think you will probably see fewer large trees in suburban gardens, mainly because sites will not be big enough to accommodate them. Certainly from some developments I was looking at recently in Tauranga, there was no room on the site for a substantive tree. However, some councils in Australia are in actual fact moving back to requiring developers to actually plant trees to try and increase shade in urban areas because of the problems with heating due to climate change.
Yeah.
And that is considered to be one of the ways of dealing with it, and alongside painting your roof white. It's actually a requirement now in some parts of Sydney and Melbourne, in new developing areas.
Caroline, I really appreciated the width of material, which are issues and concerns that have been raised this evening. It's been very interesting. Are there any further questions before I close? Well, Caroline, can I thank you very much for the effort you put into this and the incredible range. I can still think of more questions. I'd like to for example, raise the issue about how a planner becomes a person with enough resilience in a place of work to be able to work both in a political and a professional environment, where we know a lot about the workplace nowadays, that you're likely to be attacked as an individual on the basis of issues to do with gender and race, even before someone wants to address you on issues to do with the strength of your argument or the quality of your research or the depth of your knowledge. So it is an environment where you are putting yourself in a professional place to be a contested individual. And we need to do a lot more about understanding how that is toxic, and that runs a risk of not only failing the individuals involved, but also of ending up with bad quality decision making and bad quality outcomes for us who have to live in a society which is made up of people that are just playing politics in the little nuanced environments where the consequences are huge, but the insight and transparency is almost negligible. So I take your point, and I say that because I'm a person who spent most of his life training social workers to be resistant practitioners in a toxic environment. And so I have some comparison with what you would be thinking about in the town planning one. Having said that, I want to give everybody my thanks for coming tonight, for being on the Zoom. I appreciate the range of people we've had here, and I also want to just let you know that the final Auckland-based Fabian session for this year will be next Thursday night on 2nd of December, when we hope to have, we are having 4 of the more recent MPs that have come into Parliament in the last election. We started planning this session when it would have been closer to a year after they'd first been in Parliament, because we wanted to ask them, so what's it been like? What's a year's worth in that house been like? How's it affected you? What have you learned? I'm not so much about whether they've achieved anything at this point in their political careers, but I do want to know a lot about how they're coping, what strategies they're developing, and what type of experience they're having, because this is the first of 3 years before they get a chance to tell us that they want to be in it some more. So we've got four MPs talking to us next week who have all had that 1 year's worth of experience. And with that in mind, any further comments or questions? Thank you all, and see you all later.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
then.